Welcome, dear listeners. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight I want to share a story with you. A story of memory, hidden truth, sorrow, endurance, and the slow return of a soul to its own light. This is The House of Ash and Starlight by Tries Christie. In the north wing of the House of Ash and Starlight, where frost gathered in the corners of the window panes and dust lay soft as old grief upon the beams, there slept a servant called Little Ashes. No one in the house remembered who had first given that name. It had the sound of something spoken carelessly and repeated too often, until the syllables settled like soot upon a soul. In time, even the servants used it without thought, though some did so with pity and others with the small frightened cruelty that blooms in places ruled by watchful power. Little Ashes slept in a narrow chamber just beneath the roof, where winter entered through the stones and the wind moved quietly behind the walls, as though the house itself were breathing in uneasy dreams. There was a truckle bed with one broken wheel, a wash basin pale with cracks, and a single high window through which a portion of the night sky could be seen when the clouds were kind. On clear evenings the stars gathered there like patient witnesses, remote and white and strangely familiar. By morning, Little Ashes moved through the lower halls in plain garments the colour of cinder and rainwater, with soot upon the cuffs and flour at the wrists, carrying trays, scrubbing silver, tending hearths, and learning the moods of the great house, as one learns the weather of a dangerous country. The work was never quite finished. There was always another corridor to sweep, another stair to polish, another chamber to set in order before the bell rang again. The mistress of the house, whom the outer world praised as a lady of rare beauty and unassailable grace, watched all things with cool and polished eyes. She was called Queen Miravel, though no blood of the old line ran in her veins. In public she shone. Her gowns fell in folds of ivory and frost-blue silk. Pearls lay at her throat like drops of captive moonlight. Her voice could turn soft as cream before guests, priests, magistrates, and noble visitors from the south. Many who crossed the threshold of the House of Ash and Starlight believed themselves blessed merely to be received by her. Only those within the house knew the other climate in which she ruled. Little Ashes knew it best. A glance from Queen Miravel could silence a room. A word spoken lightly at breakfast could bruise the spirit for 3 days. She had a way of arranging gentleness around cruelty so that no accusation could easily find its footing. She corrected posture with 2 fingers and a smile. She chose garments for Little Ashes that concealed every line of dignity beneath drab folds and servant's grime. She praised docility as though it were virtue, and treated obedience as though it were a kind of beauty. Above all, she guarded the mirrors. There were many in the house, for it had once belonged to a family who loved light and wished to multiply it. Tall mirrors in gilt frames stood in the east gallery. Oval glasses hung in the blue salon. There was even, according to the oldest kitchen maid, a star mirror once kept in the sealed observatory above the western tower. Yet none of these were meant for Little Ashes. Servants were not forbidden to pass them, only to linger, and if by chance Little Ashes paused too long before one, Queen Miravel somehow knew. Vanity, she would say in that voice smooth as winter cream, is especially unbecoming in those with no station to uphold. So Little Ashes learned not to look. And yet there were moments, brief as a moth's wing in candlelight, when something slipped, a reflection caught in a darkened pane after sunset, a shape in the silver backs of spoons, a figure not wholly the one the house insisted upon. Those moments vanished almost at once, yet each left behind the same strange ache, as if some hidden chamber within the chest had been knocked upon from the inside. It was on the first morning of the deep frost, when the garden statues wore collars of ice and the fountains stood silent beneath their white glass, that the white fox appeared. Little ashes had risen before dawn to empty the ashpans from the lesser hearths and carry fresh wood to the kitchens. The courtyard stones bit through thin soles. Breath hung in the dark like pale silk. No one else was awake except the scullery girl snoring beside the ovens and the old clock in the servants' hall, which had been losing time for years and no longer seemed to care. At the far end of the courtyard, where the wall had begun to crack beneath a climbing rose long dead from neglect, the fox stood watching. Its coat was white as new snow, yet no frost clung to it. Its eyes were bright and steady, not wild, not tame, and full of a grave intelligence that made little ashes stop as though called by name. For a long moment neither moved. Then the fox turned its head toward the north tower, where the attic window looked over the sleeping grounds and the last stars trembled above the black trees. Little Ashes felt, with sudden and unreasonable force, the pain of having forgotten something immeasurably important. The ash bucket slipped from numb fingers and struck the stones. At the sound, the fox was gone. Only a single white hair remained upon the courtyard frost, gleaming faintly in the hour before dawn. By noon the house had resumed its old machinery. Bells rang, doors opened and closed, servants crossed the passages with lowered eyes. Queen Miraval received a visiting canon in the music room and spoke at length about charity. Little Ashes was set to polishing the silver ewers in the long pantry, where narrow windows admitted a thin wash of winter light. In one of the great ewers, curved bright as still water, a reflection wavered into being. Little Ashes looked up by accident and froze. For the span of one breath, the face in the silver was finer boned, clearer, strangely luminous. Something princely rested within it. Something soft, too, like moonlight through blue silk. The mouth was familiar, though less bowed by caution. The eyes held a steadier fire. Then footsteps sounded at the far end of the pantry. The surface shivered. The old image returned. Little Ashes set the ewer down with a trembling hand. That evening, after the lamps had been lowered in the drawing rooms, and the house had settled into its second life of whispered orders and hidden fatigue, old Mireia the laundress pressed a folded square of cloth into Little Ashes's palm. "For your window," she murmured, never lifting her gaze, "so the draught takes less of you." In the attic, by candlelight, Little Ashes unfolded the gift. It was a handkerchief of very old make, worn almost to transparency, embroidered at one corner with thread so faded it could hardly be named. Yet when the candle flame moved across it, the colours stirred. Pale blue, soft rose, white like winter dawn. Something broke open in the chest then, not as memory exactly, but as grief with memory folded inside it. Little Ashes pressed the cloth to the lips and wept without sound. That night a dream came. There was a hall full of stars, not overhead, but beneath glass underfoot, as if the dreamer walked upon the sky itself. Voices rose in song. A pair of doors opened inward. At the end of the hall stood a figure clothed in pale blue and silver fire, neither woman nor man in any narrow earthly sense, but radiant with both tenderness and authority. A circlet gleamed on the brow. White and rose gold trains flowed from the shoulders like living light. Someone knelt and said a name. Little Ashes woke before it could be heard. For 3 days the fox did not return. Morning followed morning with the same small burdens: bread to slice, rugs to beat, steps to scrub. At noon, Queen Miravel directed the arrangement of flowers in the great hall, and told the steward in a tone of exquisite annoyance that Little Ashes had become clumsy of late. At evening, musicians rehearsed in the West Salon for the midwinter assembly, which would take place in 7 nights' time. The house brightened in preparation for guests, while the attic seemed colder than ever. On the 4th morning, as grey light filtered through the window, the fox was sitting upon the sill outside. The sight was so impossible that Little Ashes forgot to be afraid. The window had long been swollen in its frame, and scarcely opened more than a hand's breadth, yet the fox sat there lightly as frost, its tail curled round its feet, its gaze fixed upon the cracked trunk at the foot of the bed. Little Ashes looked at the trunk. It had always been there, warped and narrow, with tarnished brass corners and no key. In all the years of sleeping in that room, no one had spoken of it. It seemed part of the chamber itself, as permanent as the slanted ceiling or the wind in the walls. The fox tapped once against the pane with one white paw. Then it vanished. Little Ashes knelt before the trunk. The lock was rusted through. It yielded to the first hard twist of the hairpin. Inside lay a confusion of moth-eaten cloth, old ribbon, a broken comb, and at the very bottom a flat parcel wrapped in linen. Hands shaking, Little Ashes drew it out. It was a book, though half burned along one edge, its leather cover stamped with an emblem nearly effaced by smoke and time. Still, by turning it toward the light, the pattern could be seen: a moon, a star, a sword upright between them. Little Ashes traced the mark with one finger and felt a jolt of recognition so severe that the room seemed to tilt. Inside, many pages had been torn away. Those that remained were written in a fine hand that made the eye ache with familiarity. There were fragments only: broken genealogies, bits of song, drawings of crowns, observatories, ceremonial garments. One line appeared again and again in differing form, as though copied from older texts. The double-crowned line keeps the balance of dawn and dusk. Another passage, scorched but legible, made Little Ashes go cold. After the falling of glass and fire, the child was hidden. Let no false regent break the union, for a sundered heir forgets the whole kingdom with them. There followed a blot of ink, then only a few surviving words. If memory dims, the signs remain: the fox of the north garden, the star mirror, the name asleep beneath ashes. At noon that same day, while carrying hot water past the blue salon, Little Ashes heard Queen Miraval speaking within to the visiting canon. "The old line is finished," she was saying. "That is mercy, in its way. Certain bloods are too unstable for rule, too prone to confusion, strange airs, divided nature." The canon gave a careful murmur of agreement. Queen Miravel continued, her tone almost fond. "This house required firm stewardship after the calamities of former years. Fantasy had to be pruned, ceremony simplified, children guided into safer forms." Little Ashes stood motionless in the passage with the steaming ewer growing heavier in both hands. Something in those words struck like flint. That evening, a snow began to fall, softly at first, then with deeper intent, thickening the terraces and swallowing the yews in white. After supper, the lower servants were dismissed early to bank the kitchen fires, for the house had gone upstairs into music and candlelight. From the attic window, Little Ashes watched flakes cross the starlit dark and thought of the phrase that would not leave the mind: children guided into safer forms. Long after midnight, sleep came in fragments. Somewhere between waking and dream, the white fox appeared again, not in the room this time, but at the foot of a stair Little Ashes had never seen. It climbed. Little Ashes followed, higher and higher through the hidden spaces of the house, behind walls, through chambers full of veiled furniture and rolled carpets and dust-sheeted clocks, until they reached a round door banded in iron. The fox looked back once. Little Ashes touched the latch. The dream broke. Morning came late, and pearl grey, the snow still falling. Queen Mirabelle announced at breakfast that the old observatory above the western tower was to remain locked through midwinter on account of structural danger. No servant was to go near the upper stair. As she spoke, her eyes rested on Little Ashes for a heartbeat too long. By noon, the house was full of preparations. Florists arrived from the village with white hellebore and silver fir. The steward barked orders. Footmen polished sconces until their hands reddened. Seamstresses came and went with boxes. Queen Mirabelle passed among them in a gown of pale violet velvet, serene as a saint in glass, praising one arrangement, correcting another. Little Ashes was sent to the old linen closets on the third floor to fetch more tablecloths. There, between shelves of lavendered sheets, the white fox slipped through a narrow service door and paused. Without thinking, Little Ashes followed. The passage beyond was black and close with disuse. Cobwebs brushed the face. The air smelled of old paper and stone. The fox's white shape moved ahead like a bit of winter moonlight. At the end of the corridor stood the stair from the dream, winding upward into dark. Little Ashes climbed. The stair ended at the round iron-banded door. This time it was real. A key had once hung nearby, only the hook remained. Yet the lock had corroded and split. A long push with the shoulder broke it open. The observatory smelled of dust, cold metal, and forgotten skies. Its great dome, cracked in one quadrant, admitted a shaft of one afternoon light. Shelves lined the walls, full of tarnished instruments and rolled charts. At the center stood the star mirror, veiled in black cloth. Little Ashes approached with breath caught high in the throat and pulled the cloth away. The glass beneath was dark, not reflective in the ordinary way, more like deep water before dawn. Slowly, as if waking, it brightened. A figure appeared. Not the servant in ash-colored dress, not the drudged and narrowed shape the house had taught. This one stood taller. The shoulders were freer. The face held both gentleness and command. The eyes were full of sorrow and of dawn. Rose, white, and pale blue light drifted around the figure as if memory itself had become color. Little Ashes reached toward the glass. The figure in the mirror did the same. And then, not with ears but with the whole inward being, a name was heard. Lumisareth. The room shuddered. The dome gave a low metallic cry, as though some tension held too long had finally begun to loosen. Across the shelves, star charts unrolled themselves and fell open. Dust rose in golden swarms. Somewhere far below, bells rang out of time with no human hand upon them. Lumisareth staggered back against the central table, trembling from crown to heel. Memories did not pour in all at once. They came as shards. A warm hand fastening a circlet at a child's brow. A hall of constellations. Lessons in sword form at sunrise. A blue-white mantle placed round young shoulders. A voice saying, "With deep love, you must keep the two lights joined." Then shouting, breaking glass, fire reflected in telescopes, the cold smile of Mirabelle bending low, a draught pressed to the lips, a long falling into forgetfulness. The servant name Little Ashes still clung like soot. The waking name Lumisareth rose beneath it, bright and terrible and true. By evening the change had already begun. Nothing outward could yet have been named by an unobservant eye. The dress was the same. The hair remained unbound. Ash still marked the hands, yet the body had remembered a different balance. The spine lengthened. The gaze no longer dropped so quickly. When the kitchen boy snapped for help with the crate of apples, Lumisarath turned slowly instead of flinching, and the boy fell silent without knowing why. Queen Mirabelle noticed. She said little through supper, though the line of her mouth sharpened. After the trays were cleared and the servants dismissed, she sent for Lumisarath to attend her in the private dressing room. There, among crystal bottles and combs of ivory, Mirabelle sat before a 3-panel mirror while her maid fastened pearls into her dark hair. When the maid was gone, she said, "Come closer." Lumisarath obeyed. Mirabelle looked up through the mirror, and for the first time in many years some fraction of her composure cracked. "So," she said quietly, "the house has begun gossiping." Lumisarath did not answer. Mirabelle rose. In candlelight she seemed beautiful enough to wound. "You were safer in smaller clothes and smaller thoughts," she said. "You were easier to protect from yourself." "Protect," Lumisarath repeated, and even to their own ears the voice sounded altered, lower in some hidden chamber, clearer in others. Mirabelle moved nearer. "You do not understand what you are, what the old line brought with it: division, instability, hunger for pageant and strange unions. The kingdom suffered for such excess." "The kingdom forgot," Lumisarath said. Miravelle's hand flashed out and struck the face. For a moment the room held only the candle hiss and the ringing in the skull. Lumisarath tasted blood and did not bow. Something like fear entered Mirabelle then. Very quickly she buried it. "Tomorrow night," she said, each word cut smooth and hard, "the midwinter assembly will begin. You will remain below stairs. You will wear the grey servant's dress. You will not speak unless spoken to. If you value the few scraps of comfort still permitted you, you will let this little fever pass." Lumisarath met her gaze. Somewhere within that gaze, a child still expected punishment to decide everything. Somewhere else, newly risen, another self had begun to understand that Miravelle's power was not infinite. It depended on silence, on forgetfulness, on the agreement of others to see what she instructed them to see. That night the white fox returned to the attic, carrying something in its mouth. It laid the object upon the bed and withdrew to the window. It was a key of silver darkened by age, shaped like a branch with 2 leaves. Wrapped around it was a strip of silk in pale blue, white and rose. Lumisarath knew without knowing how that the key belonged to the cedar coffer in the observatory. Before dawn, while the house still slept, Lumisarath climbed the hidden stair again. The coffer stood beneath the cracked dome, carved with moons and stars. The silver key turned easily. Inside lay folded garments preserved in cedar and myrrh, a mantle white as winter light, a long coat of pale blue shot through with silver thread, a ceremonial underrobe lined in soft rose, a circlet of white gold. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth of gold, a narrow sword. When Lumisarath touched its hilt, warmth ran up the arm like remembered music. Day unfolded in a strange brightness. Snow ceased. Noon came clear and blue. Guests arrived in sleighs and carriages, their laughter carrying over the terraces. Candles were set everywhere, so that by late afternoon the house seemed to float in honey-coloured fire. Musicians tuned in the west salon. Servants hurried with trays of mulled wine and sugared pears. Queen Mirabelle moved through the throng splendid as frost in bloom, receiving compliments and blessings with gracious ease. Lumisarath worked below stairs until dusk, as ordered. Then, when the first dance began overhead and the whole house turned its attention towards spectacle, Lumisareth climbed. In the observatory, the final light of evening lay across the floor in a blue bar. One by one the garments were put on, not as costume, as remembrance. The white robe settled first, light yet grave. The pale blue coat followed, shaped with quiet majesty. The rose lining glimmered when the fabric moved, as if dawn itself had hidden there. The circlet rested cool upon the brow. The sword hung at the side. Lumisareth looked into the star mirror and saw no servant there. The face was fully their own now. Feminine grace had not vanished. Masculine nobility had not overwhelmed it. Both stood joined in one sovereign being, clear as moonlight on a blade. Down below, the assembly was nearing its height. A hymn was being sung for midwinter's turning, the old words thinned and altered by generations of forgetting. Lumisareth descended the grand stair. Conversation faltered. Music tripped and ceased. Every face lifted. At the foot of the stair, Queen Mirabelle stood rigid, one hand still raised in elegant explanation to a visiting lord. For 3 long seconds no one moved. Then old Mireia the laundress, who had once tucked a faded handkerchief into a servant's hand, set down her tray and sank to one knee. The stablemaster followed, then the undercook, then the steward, weeping openly though he seemed not to know why. A murmur ran through the hall like wind in the hidden forest. "The line," someone whispered. "The old sign, the double crown." Mirabelle found her voice first. "This is a masquerade," she said, smiling too brightly. "A sick little game played by one who has long required gentler discipline. Dear friends, you see before you a troubled servant dressed in stolen relics." Lumisareth stepped forward into the center of the hall. The chandeliers above, long clouded by soot and neglect, suddenly burned with a clearer light. In the tall mirrors of the east gallery, reflections multiplied. Not grey cloth, not a sham. Everywhere the house answered with recognition. Lumisareth drew the sword, not to threaten, to reveal. Its blade shone white gold from guard to tip. Along the fuller ran an inscription sleeping for decades beneath tarnish. As the light touched it, the words blazed awake. Lumisareth, heir of the joined dawn, keeper of the balance of star and flame. A sound went through the room then, half sob, half song. Miravelle's face emptied. "You know nothing," she said, and the sweetness had fled her voice at last. "You know nothing of what was required. The kingdom would have split beneath such blood. I held it together. You held it under a veil," said Lumisareth. Miravelle's hands clenched. "I gave it order. You gave it fear." The words moved outward through the room and settled in the faces there. One by one, memories seemed to stir. Old paintings half remembered, nursery songs, the shape of the lost emblem. A story grandmothers had once whispered about royal children born with 2 lights in one soul. The canon who had praised Miravelle's stewardship 2 days before now looked at her with dawning horror. Mireia rose from her knee and said, in a shaking voice, "She burned the West records." A footman added, "She dismissed the tutors." The steward said, "She locked the observatory." Another voice, then another. "She said the line was diseased." She forbade the old songs. She drugged the child. Mirabelle turned slowly, as if seeing for the first time that the house had slipped from her grasp while she was still speaking. For one heartbeat, Lumisareth pitied her. There had once been hunger in this woman, perhaps a fear of being cast out by histories larger than herself. Yet what she built from that hunger had been a reign of narrowing, and the cost of it stood in every cold room of the house. "Queen no longer," said the visiting lord from the south, and his voice carried the force of witnessed truth. You have ruled under concealment and wrong inheritance." Mirabelle straightened. A remnant of elegance gathered around her like frost. "Then let me go," she said. "I will not kneel to this confusion." "No," said Lumisareth, and the word rang cleanly through the hall. "You will not kneel. You will leave." The sentence passed through the assembly like a seal pressed into wax. Before midnight, Mirabelle was escorted from the house with 2 trunks, a cloak, and the name she had fashioned for herself stripped of lawful weight. Snow had begun again, fine and silver under the lanterns. She did not look back at the threshold. The carriage took her south toward the border abbeys, where exiled gentlewomen sometimes vanished into prayer or bitterness or both. When the wheels were gone from hearing, silence filled the great hall. It was near 1 in the morning. Candles had burned low. Snowlight touched the windows. Lumisareth stood where the false queen had stood and felt, not triumph, but a vast release, like a room long locked finally opened to winter stars. Then, from somewhere among the servants, a voice began the old midwinter hymn in its fuller form. Others joined. The melody rose through the house, into the stairwells, along the galleries, up to the cracked observatory dome. People wept as they sang, though many could not have said for whom. For the lost years, perhaps, for the kingdom's forgetting, for the child in ashes, for themselves. Morning came pale and holy. No bell rang at dawn. No command snapped through the passages. The servants emerged slowly from their rooms, as if uncertain the world would hold. Frost shone on every pane. In the courtyard, the dead-climbing rose on the broken wall had opened one impossible bloom, white at the edges and flushed with the faintest rose at its heart. Lumisareth stood beneath the open sky, wrapped in the pale blue coat, the circlet catching first light, the sword at rest. The white fox waited by the gate. For a moment they regarded one another in silence. Then the fox dipped its head, as if in acknowledgement, and slipped into the northern woods. By noon the house was already changing. Mirrors were uncovered. Windows opened. The old emblem of moon, star and sword was brought down from storerooms and cleaned. The observatory doors remained wide. Messengers rode out with news. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread rather than fear. The servants moved with a strange tender awkwardness, like people relearning the use of limbs long kept still. In the evening, as the first stars appeared one by one above the dark pines, Lumisareth climbed to the attic room for the last time. The narrow bed still stood beneath the slanted roof. The cracked basin still held a skin of ice. The little square of faded cloth in blue, white and rose still lay upon the sill. Lumisareth touched the bedpost, the wall, the worn floorboards. These too had borne witness. These too belonged to the story. At the window, the night opened vast and clear. Far below, lamps burned warmly in the halls of the house of ash and starlight, no longer a prison, not yet fully healed either. Houses, like kingdoms, remembered slowly. Lumisareth laid the servant's grey dress upon the bed. Little ashes, they said softly into the dim room, and the name no longer felt like a wound. You kept the fire. Then they left the attic and closed the door gently behind them. Years later, songs would be made of the midwinter, when the hidden air descended the stair in the colours of remembered dawn and reclaimed the old house. Ballads would speak of Queen Mirabelle's exile, of the white fox who guided the lost royal child, of the observatory where the star mirror woke, of the line restored. Yet the truest part of the tale would remain quieter than song. It would live in the knowledge that there are forms of cruelty devoted to making a soul forget its own shape, and forms of courage devoted to remembering. It would live in the joining of what had been split. in the hour when ash gave way to light, without surrendering the tenderness that had survived among the cinders. And whenever winter pressed frost against the panes of the house of ash and starlight, those who dwelt there would sometimes look up toward the western tower and think they saw, crossing the snow at dawn, the swift white figure of a fox, bright as a blessing vanishing into the trees. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending this time here with me. I hope this story touched something deep and quiet in you, and that it left you with a little more light, a little more courage, and a little more tenderness for the parts of the soul that endure. Until next time, take gentle care.